largest and most important island of the West Indies is Cuba. 150 miles south of Florida, the island of Cuba was discovered by Columbus in 1492 and was under the control of Spain for most of the period up to 1898, when she gained her independence. Capital and largest city of the
Cuba. Cuba is a very interesting place, with a notable 12-year exception between 1940 and 1952. Since the Spanish colonized the island in 1492, Cuba and its people have been in a constant and seemingly never-ending struggle for freedom. Cuban revolutionaries would try and fail multiple times in the 19th century to liberate Cuba from Spanish control, most notably the 10 Years' War. But it was finally in 1895 when the now so-called War of Independence started. It was mainly organized by José Martí, a poet and philosopher who brought back and united the heroes of the 10 Years' War to finally liberate Cuba. This is a topic that deserves its own video that will be surely be coming in the future. The US, on the other hand, has always looked upon Cuba as a great addition to the Union. Thomas Jefferson himself, third president and founding father of the United States, as well as author of the Declaration of Independence, expressed his interest in annexing Cuba in a letter to then President James Monroe. "I have ever looked upon Cuba as the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states," wrote Jefferson. After the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, the United States would declare war on Spain. Famously, the Rough Riders of Theodore Roosevelt, future President of the United States, will help the man business win their war for independence. The thing is that Cuba was not handed to the Cuban people to rule as they saw fit after that war. The United States will begin the first major occupation of Cuba right after the war. Leonard Wood will become the first American appointed governor of Cuba. Cuba had always been a powerhouse of sugar production, and under the occupation, Cuba will become the major producer of sugar for the United States. Sugar will become 80% of the Cuban economy. The US was not great at producing sugar, with 1 year worth of sugar cane production in the United States only lasting them 1 month. The US would set a quota for Cuban sugar imports, which gave Cuba the opportunity to plan their economy, since they knew how much sugar was going to be bought every year. This booming sugar demand would attract a lot of very needed immigrants to the island, like Catholic Germans and Spanish army soldiers who had fought against the rebels just a few years prior. The first US occupation would end with the passage of the new constitution in 1901, which included the now infamous Platt Amendment. This amendment would let the US intervene in Cuban politics whenever they saw fit. It forced Cuba to sell or lease land to the US, which led to the creation of the Guantanamo base, and limited Cuba's abilities to make treaties with other countries. This would start the next struggle for Cuba in their way to freedom. The next year, in 1902, Tomás Estrada Palma would become the first president of Cuba. President Estrada Palma ran completely unopposed in the presidential elections. This wasn't due to Estrada Palma being a Washington-like figure. It was actually due to others deciding not to run in protest, since Estrada Palma was seen as the quote-unquote American candidate, nothing else but a puppet who would have the interests of the American investor in mind instead of that of the Cuban people. After riots and constant pressure, President Tomás Estrada Palma would seek a US intervention in Cuba in order to take back control. The US will quickly mobilize its forces and invade unannounced, taking over the island incredibly easy due to the non-existent Cuban army. This kickstarted the second major American occupation. The US would appoint William Howard Taft, future US President and Chief Justice, as the American appointed governor of Cuba, and would later be replaced by Charles Magoon. As soon as the occupation began, ports and railways were put under complete control of the US. These actions and meddling by the US were completely legal under the Platt Amendment. Under this occupation, the US would strengthen their economic connections and control over the island. American investment and massive American-run companies would control most of the production and Cuban economy. This would start a serious corruption culture within the Cuban government. The occupation would come to an end, and José Miguel Gómez will become the second president of Cuba. Gómez's presidency would end in 1913, and Mario García Manocal will become the third president of Cuba. President Garcia Manoca would lead Cuba through the First World War. During this time, the sugar industry was greatly controlled by Russia and the German Empire, which would grow sugar beets. During World War I, these two countries were in constant conflict, causing the sugar trade and infrastructure to collapse. Cuba would then proceed to fill the high demand for sugar, while the price skyrocketed, going from 3 cents to 22 cents a pound. This would start the period now known as the Fat Cows. Cuba would become a complete monoculture economy by changing coffee plantations to sugar and demolishing forests in order to create more plantations, which boosted sugar production. The Fat Cows period brought an immense economic boom to the island and lasted all throughout the First World War. After the end of World War I, though, European powers would open up all trade routes for sugar. This, combined with the increase in sugar production in other countries trying to take advantage of the scarcity to the war, made the price of sugar plummet. Cuba would begin a horrible economic period known as the skinny cows, as unemployment would skyrocket and social unrest was extremely high. American companies would make sure the Cuban associates of their higher class from Spanish heritage would have nothing to ask for, even such a horrible economic depression. This would create a horrible wealth disparity without a middle class, which made Cuba a fertile ground for the rise of the communist ideology. Alfredo Zayas would win the 1921 presidential elections, but his presidency would start with bad news when it was announced that the US had found different trade routes for sugar, worsening the economy and creating constant protests and turmoil as unemployment just kept going up and up and up. Later, in 1925, Gerardo Machado, a military leader during the War of Independence, would become the new president. President Machado would start a series of government policies that would stimulate the economy and lower the unemployment rate with massive and ambitious progressive public works plans that were financed by American banks. President Machado would build up Cuban infrastructure, education, and water systems, doing right by his campaign promise: water, roads, schools. President Machado would build a national highway, which created an alternative for the American-owned railway. Constructed the Capitolio as well as other Cuban landmarks. Cuba would have the most advanced telephone system in the Americas and the most radio stations per capita in the world. But then, at the height of Machado's presidency and Cuba's prosperity, on October 29, 1929, the American stock market would plummet, starting the Great Depression. The Great Depression started to hit Cuba in 1931, and American banks that have financed the beloved projects of Machado will come knocking for their money. Machado will start to make massive cuts on spending and will slowly increase military and police action in order to keep control and stay in power. He will slowly become a dictator and will be accused by the Cuban people of trying to start Caribbean fascism after he deported opposition leader Ramon Grau, seen here with a mustache that will surely be going out of style very soon. This will kickstart the next Cuban Revolution, the now called the 1933 Revolution. Fulgencio Batista was one of the few non-white officers who will meet a lot of the opposition leaders during their trials in the military court and will become very well connected. On September 4th, 1933, Batista made an arousing speech to his troops, and they would join him in the revolt. They would take their white generals as prisoners and would name himself the Chief of the Armed Forces.
Machine guns in the shadow of Cuba's capital sent bullets into the street crowds when President Machado answered the first demands that he resign with a hail of lead. The police were reinforced by troops as Havana was put under martial law. 20 citizens were killed and 160 wounded before the police dispersed the crowds and filled the streets with armed patrols. Machado's known foes were rounded up in an attempt to end disorder. Up to the present uprising, Machado, secure in the National Palace and backed by the army, has ruthlessly suppressed all attempts to oust him. Here you see him greeting officers who vowed loyalty to him during the unrest. Following the recent bloodshed in the streets, the thoroughfares resembled those of a deserted city. While there was no visible sign of danger, machine guns commanded all approaches to the Capitol and National Palace, and the terrified populace stayed indoors. For months, Machado feared attempts on his life whenever he ventured abroad. And here you see him leaving the Capitol, surrounded by a human wall of guards. losing himself in their midst and ready to dart into the armored cars awaiting him. A president threatened by his own people.
Gerardo Machado will be forced to leave Cuba for the US after a general's revolt, and will try to get another US occupation on Cuba. After the exit of Machado, the generals were in control of Cuba and tried to quell the social unrest by handing out harsh sentences. A group of generals and officers would not follow Batista, but proceed to barricade themselves in the Hotel Nacional and try to plead for American intervention. But this time, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was against it. General Batista would quickly round up 2,000 troops and attack the 400 soldiers barricaded in the Hotel Nacional. After 2 days of battle, Batista came out the winner.
Cuba. Bullet-riddled Havana recovers from a hail of lead after a 2-day battle which shook the Grau San Martin government, adding one more uprising to the civil disorders that have been disturbing the peace of the island republic. Historic Fort Ataris was reduced to a shambles, and the city's streets were scattered with debris, grim testimony of the siege that had taken place but a few hours before. 150 were killed and more than 300 wounded in the fighting between the secret ABC forces and the government soldiers. Put under heavy guard, the rebel prisoners were well cared for, but every one faces court-martial and a possible sentence of death. Sergeant General Batista headed the forces that quelled the outbreak and is once again acclaimed the savior of the new Cuba. But while the soldiers of the general staff enjoy their victory, members of the vanquished rebel forces face the stern board of military justice, fighting to avoid a death penalty.
Batista would then invite back Ramon Grau, which would kickstart the Pentarchy, a period of 5 days between September 5th and 10th of 1933, where Cuba was led by a council of 5 people: Sergio Carbó, a journalist; Porfirio Franca y Álvarez de la Campa, an attorney, banker, and economist; Ramon Grau San Martin, a professor of medicine at the University of Havana; José Miguel Irizarry y Gamio, an attorney; and finally Guillermo Portela y Moller, a professor of law at the University of Havana. Ramon Grau will be picked as president by the Pentarchy and will start what is now known as the 100-day government. The 100-day government is mainly remembered for left-leaning or progressive reforms, such as the establishment of the 8-hour workday, a raise in minimum wage, nationalization of the Cuban Electric Company, and granting autonomy to the University of Havana. The Grau government was facing some serious backlash from the United States, which saw the reforms as communist stepping stones, and therefore refused to recognize the new Grau presidency as legitimate. While Fulgencio Batista nominally surrendered the power of the army to the new government, he was having talks and making behind-door deals with the American ambassador to Cuba, Sumner Welles. Ambassador Welles would give an ultimatum to Batista, who then proceeded to depose the Grau government on January 15, 1934. Batista would appoint Carlos Javia as president and annulled all previous reforms. Then, just 2 days later, Batista would depose Javia for Manuel Marquez Sterling, who would in turn last a full 2 hours until he was deposed again by Batista, who proceeded to name Carlos Mendieta as the new president. There was a lot of confusion at the time, but one thing was 100% clear: Fulgencio Batista was the true leader of Cuba. On May 29, 1934, after the United States felt satisfied with the Batista leadership, the Platt Amendment will be annulled. This will mark the very first time that Cuba will be free from the grips of another nation, but in turn will kickstart the Batista era.